The past few years have actually been an amazing time for both indie and AA RPGs, with titles like Expedition 33, Chained Echoes, Sea of Stars, and dozens more being released in the space and showing what passion projects can do for the genre. And today we're taking a look at a new game in that growing list, specifically Quartet. And while much like the other titles mentioned, it has some flaws and quirks, but overall the experience I had with Quartet was exceptional, and I can wholeheartedly recommend it. Though, obviously, you came here for more than just a simple thumbs up or thumbs down, so let's look at both the good and bad of this title. And, as usual, to avoid spoilers, the story section will be at the end of the review, and if you're interested in seeing how I came to my various opinions on Quartet, the full playthrough will be available over on the Let's Play Everything channel, including most of the optional side content. Now, starting out, I would say Quartet does quite well at delivering on the big three of RPGs: the story, the music, and the combat system, with every single one of these aspects paying obvious homage to other games and media, but still not being afraid to take its own unique spin on the formula. The combat system, for example, at least on the surface, will appear pretty standard, with the turn order bar giving obvious flashbacks to games like Final Fantasy X. And while the skill options are going to be a bit more simplified with only a handful per character, they give them a unique feel, with the focus more on each character having an arsenal specific to them, even so far as their basic defend function being a reflection of their abilities as well, with each getting distinct modifiers and buffs in addition to an increased income of their AP. The way Quartet twists this formula, though, is actually through being somewhat innovative about its mana system. You may notice in the background that it doesn't say MP or mana. Instead, it is listed as a percent, or in some places mentioned as AP or action points. The way the system works is much more akin to a stamina bar, replenishing over time as you fight. Now, to keep it balanced, it does not replenish outside of combat unless you use an item to do so, but I think it strikes a really nice balance between the classic depleting MP systems of yesteryear and the trendy start at full systems of indies in the last few years. This also has yet another reason for existing, though, and they actually mention it a few times, and that is, once you reach about the midpoint in the game, you'll have enough characters for both front and backline, with the front line obviously doing the fighting and the backline being out of combat, but restoring its action points at a higher rate, incentivizing you to hot swap your characters should you play like a normal person and actually take full advantage of your roster. Now I'm a bit of a nerd and defied this because I like seeing if I can break stuff. And funnily enough, with a bit of patience and stubbornness, it is entirely possible to play with just your favorite characters. And it becomes exceptionally easy to do so whenever you are near the end game if you dig around and discover certain shops and grinding sites that seem to have been intentionally built into the game for people who, well, like to break stuff and go to extremes. Now, as is standard for me, I'm not one to just gush about what I like, but the reality is, as much as I want to nitpick about the minor flaws in this combat system, I'm hard-pressed to find any that actually stick. This is because everything that made me grumble a bit is there for a reason. For example, the fight command seems fairly restricted in its damage output, with it feeling like most of the scaling in it is coming from your weapon choices, with the exception of one character, of course. Though this does keep up with enemy toughness fairly well, and on the flip side, investing in strength actually does boost your physical skill damage at a much more noticeable rate, further pushing you towards the recommended playstyle of using your skills heavily and rotating your party. The game does also let you use normal fight commands fairly effectively as a method of letting your AP regenerate, even though defending is faster in that regard, though you really only get the noticeable fight command amplifiers later, and those allow you to do things like double attack or attack all enemies at once by using up your accessory slots. The main use I ended up finding for the basic fight command, though, was more the weakness exploit system, which lets you basically do the standard boosted damage against weaknesses and weakened or nullified damage against resists and immunities. Though I would say the elemental weakness and resistances were a little more obvious than the physical weaknesses and resistances of enemies. And I usually just stumbled upon whatever blunt piercing or slashing was better against a target by running out of mana and whacking them with my attack on a cooldown turn. As far as the unique enemy mechanics, they were a little less frequent, with most of them being the standard hits and debuff systems, though a few did actually end up playing with your AP, either by debuffing your recharge rate or even attacking your action points directly. Most of the bosses with the really distinct mechanics weren't found until the character side quest and optional dungeon sections later in the game, and of course the final dungeon. Even then, most of them are what you'd expect from RPG bosses in their space, though I still think that Osmos should have been called Drain because it hurts my brain for it not to be. The world travel is pretty straightforward as well, with the first half spent walking around standard dungeon and world maps, and then later on getting the minor spoiler here, an obligatory airship to fly around and explore all the places you missed. And while I will save the actual spoiler map discussion for later, I want to note here, early and loud, that I wish I could hover over dots on the map and see what they were called. I wish the accessible areas were a little more apparent as well, since I often miss the little white doors when flying around. Now, back on the basic mechanical stuff of travel, Overworld is fairly basic, but the dungeons, you do actually see some simple puzzles and traps in them. Though, for the most part, I would say they are a bit too simple for my taste in many cases, since they can pretty much all be brute forced, and I never felt particularly challenged by them. And I do wish they were a bit more in line with classic dungeon puzzles like Lufia, or at the very least some modern dungeon puzzles like Sea of Stars. And probably the last map and combat aspect worth noting is that the game predominantly follows the same combat encounter rules as games like Chrono Trigger. You'll see it on the map before you have to fight it. There are exceptions, of course, like ambushes, but there are also a couple of areas that actively have random encounters. But they're fairly overt in how they function and won't take you by surprise. Not to mention, those areas are always optional, so if you don't like random encounters, you don't need to go there to progress, and generally, they are just grinding areas you can use if you want to, though the game is perfectly doable without said grinding. Now, dipping out of the mechanical and into the aesthetics, we have probably my favorite cosmetic aspect of this game: the music. While there are a few tracks that fade into the background, most of the music in this game is exceptional at setting the atmosphere, and hell, true to its name, it even has an actual a cappella quartet that changes what it sings at different points in the story when you come across them. There's music ranging from old western tropes of cowboys and ranch hands all the way to full-on rock and roll tracks, and everything in between, even including a jaunty pirate tune. I would say the placement and use of music is, for the most part, exceptional. The only big note I'd have is that while using silence is very important to convey gravitas, I think it may be used a bit too often, especially in story transitions. Once you get to a zone, the music is spot on for the place. When there's a proper event, the music is, again, spot on. The issue is that sometimes when you're starting a new arc, the music is absent, when instead you could have had a subtle background song to begin establishing the tone of the chapter. This would have made the dramatic halts in the music so much more impactful overall. That said, unless you're looking for it or commenting over it, I doubt you'll actually notice these as much as I did, but that is part of the streamer flaws. Now, the other obvious aesthetic part is the pixel art, which is good. There's not much else to say about it. It's right around the level of solid SNES level pixel art, with the enemies being particularly interesting to look at in an almost modernized Lufia style. And I honestly don't have any complaints about it. The characters are mostly iconic, and I could probably draw them from memory with the exception of maybe Vanilla Man Jerome over there, and they convey a decent amount of emotion with the limited pixel count. It's obviously not Final Fantasy Tactics levels, but it's still better than 90% of the pixel art out there, so I'm happy and it gives it a nice level of polished feel. Now, getting all that out of the way, let's dig a bit more into the meat and possibly even the potatoes of the spoilers I warned you about earlier: the story. The spoiler light version, though, is that the general structure is pretty interesting and it works well with its chapter-based format. Namely, you get a prelude, and then you get the 4 major character arcs that introduce you to the 8 protagonists. This leads you into the core chapters of the story and ultimately blossoms out into the endgame that involves side quests, optional dungeons, and ultimately the final dungeon. The big note I would probably make is that while the store page says mild fantasy violence, the story actually hints at some fairly heavy subjects, and at one point in the recording of the gameplay, for the other channel of course, I even mentioned that maybe it should have a trigger warning at points, since it does touch on subjects like genocide, slavery, human trafficking, etc., even doing so in a manner where they effectively convey the discomfort of the characters confronting the reality of it. Though it is worth noting, it is appropriate for the story. These are not just there for shock value, because I feel the author really did speculate how certain extremes of beliefs would likely exist in the developed world. Now, for the spoiler-heavy version to hopefully explain how those kinds of subjects make their way into a fantasy game with a playable sentient hippo, is that the characters come from, simply put, extremely distinct worlds. You have Alexandra, who is born into a world where magic died, taking a large swath of the population with it, and who ultimately has to care for her ailing mother, their grocery store, as well as a plethora of technical issues around town as the haphazard machines keep breaking down. She's ultimately pulled into a mixed web of chaos where she's blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, with magic by a stranger and hurled down a path that she very much does not want anything to do with, and that causes her untold stress in spite of her immense power and unique role as an Earth mage in a world without Earth mages. Juno, on the other hand, the aforementioned sentient hippo, serves the role as her supporting character and helps her deal with these traumas while also adding a bit of a mixed emotional bag to the cast of characters. None of these are all happy or all sad, but it alternates between comic relief with references to her being an actual wild animal, and then digging into the trauma of her tribe being hunted to near extinction after a calamity. Next, in the world of Wind, there's Ben the Chef. An interesting twist on the aloof character trope. He literally just wants to work a day job, pay his bills, and live a free life. Too bad for him, learning to use lightning magic after being threatened by some mobsters ruins that for him. He is unfortunately the butt of a number of fat jokes, and getting winded going upstairs in spite of being a wind mage. Though the reality behind it gets somewhat interesting as you learn about his backstory and how he ended up where he is in life. And it really brings his comic relief aspect back down into a bit more of a recovering from tragedy perspective, and even delves a bit into the aforementioned slavery aspects. Now, the supporting character for his story is definitely written as a bit of a hard-nosed foil to his more laid-back nature, with Agata being someone who weirdly can relate to Ben's past as the story evolves, but that initially comes across as a straight-laced, by-the-books and doing-the-job kind of character from the magic regulation organization in the Wind World. She's, as the farmer says a few times, a sturdy woman, and one of the best fighters in the game, in my opinion. She also has a fairly interesting history once it starts unraveling later in the story, with some interesting takes on parental responsibility coming into play, combined with more information showing the mirroring of hers and Ben's story. In the water sides of things, we see more prim and proper society. Magic is abundant, and the main character of that arc comes from the form of high society and high skill. She's a mage named Cordelia. She generally starts out feeling a bit like a stuffy librarian trope, and then evolves into the almost cliche lawful good trope, just with a pinch of silver spoon attached. She tries to do right, dot her T's, cross her I's, and also do those the other way around, but ends up having to struggle through some rather arduous ordeals involving forbidden magic and war, something her world has not seen in ages. And she is accompanied by Mr. Jerome, who I weirdly felt was detached from the entire story until his side quest near the end, where he all of a sudden ended up becoming magical wizard Sherlock Holmes, teleporting around a house, dealing with plotting rich folks, the delusions of an old man who has homes across multiple worlds, and minds across even more, and solving a, pregnancy? It's strange. It comes out of left field, but it was fun, even if it was weird and involved a talking cat that owns a house now. Though, all that aside, it kind of leaves us with the fourth world. And while Ben's story involved the human trafficking and slavery angles and all the darker inflections those stories can hold, the story of Nikolai and Zikaron are much more on the nose. And it's just an analogy for World War II. Hard stop. And Zikaron is quite literally a golem if that tells you where it goes. Their stories are fairly tightly wound, obviously with Zikaron being his secondary character, and also the translator of the group due to his magical powers and purpose of serving as a repository as well as a protector of memories. The story is absolutely hitting the nail on the head here and does not pull any punches. We see characters get incinerated by scientific experiments. We see them bombing women and children and even using them as fuel to power their war machines. It hits on World War II generals stealing the valuables of their victims, and it even hits on the insatiable lust for power and influence of dictators. The overarching story, for me, felt like we were meant to see Alexandra as the steering force of the story, with her often being the pivot point for many events, while Nikolai is used as the anchor point to bring the antagonist in the form of a genocidal fascist analog, while the other characters serve as binding weave for all of this and their various stories of trauma caused by the decisions of those in power in the past. The intriguing thing is, outside of Nikolai and Zikaron's arcs, and the thread they pull through the game, of course, you likely would not learn most of this about the characters unless you take the time to go through the side quests of each of them, since without them, and without the optional dungeons, you merely learn how the worlds ended up how they are, and that you need to stop the ongoing attempts at bending magic to conquer the world and centralize power. I think due to this, we will see people who think this is just a game about a big bad warmonger and defeating him, since they could very easily skip all of this lore if they just rushed off to the final dungeon as soon as possible. Though, I hope for the game's sake this is the exception rather than the norm, since despite the rather traumatic energy behind it, I think it really does cement each of these characters down quite well. Now, obviously, I've left a lot to the imagination there, since I actually think playing the game makes it more impactful, since it delves much more into the conflicting feelings, the processing of grief and suffering, and even to an extent a loss of self and discovery of new values, and it does it in a way that is far better to consume firsthand rather than in a summarized review. The only catch to all of that is, after spending the 20-odd hours exploring the world, is I don't know if the game would have anywhere near the impact on a replay, outside of maybe speedrunning. This is because it hits me a lot like some of the very specific books that I've read, where the initial read hits like bricks and makes you mutter expletives about just how far they're willing to push it to make the message so much more clear, and any subsequent read will just be solely trying to see the little details and clues scattered around rather than actually enjoying and feeling impacted by these things, so it would have a much less impressive impact on the experience. Everything said and done though, do I recommend this? Yes. Do I recommend people who make RPGs play this? Also, yes. Now, is it a 10 out of 10 game? Not quite, but it doesn't need to be. It lasts just long enough, has enough punch, and is enjoyable to definitely be one of the preferred games of the year for me, which is high praise considering Expedition 33 came out this year as well.